Hello everyone, we are continuing with our series titled Studies in the Book of Proverbs. And in the previous video, we had started our discussion on the warnings against adultery. And this study we are going to do in three sections. Section 1 was already covered in the previous video where we were talking about the temptation of adultery. And in this video, we are going to talk about the consequences of adultery. Our discussions in the previous video was mainly revolving around the case study that Solomon provides us in chapter 7 about a simple, gullible young person. What does simple mean in the book of Proverbs is explained in the previous video. If you have not watched it, I would leave a link to it below. You may want to hear that and then continue with this video as well. So the simple, gullible person is met by an adulterous woman who, through her eyes and through her mouth, are communicating a lot of things to this young man. And we talked about the two important gateways towards sexual immorality: the gateway of the eyes and the gateway of the mouth. And we were talking about how dangerously this woman uses these two gateways to talk this young man into seduction. And we stopped at reading at verses 21 and so on of chapter 7. Now, in this video, we're going to talk about the consequences of adultery. And let me read from verse 21, 22, and 23 of chapter 7. With persuasive words, she led him astray. The adulterous woman led him astray. She seduced him with her smooth talk. Verse 22, all at once, he followed her like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose, till an arrow pierces his liver, like a bird darting into a snare, little knowing it will cost him his life. Because this young man did not have a predetermined response against this temptation, we are told all at once he fell into the temptation. He followed her like an ox going to the slaughter. Now, the ox does not know that he's being taken to his slaughter, and therefore he very comfortably walks towards his slaughter. Or like a deer that does not know about the snare that has been set for him, he steps into the snare. But all of a sudden, there is an arrow that pierces his liver. And like a bird darting into a snare, we are told that this young person does not know that it will cost him his life. In other words, the end result of this is going to be grievous. It's going to be dangerous. The young person has not paid attention to the consequences of sexual immorality. He chose the temporary pleasure over the long-term destruction that is going to come to him. And therefore, through these chapters, chapter 5 and 7, and then chapter 2 and 6, Solomon is trying to advise the young person, his son, about the consequences of adultery. He's trying to tell him that you have not lived for long enough on this earth, and therefore you do not have the experience that I have. You do not have the wisdom that I have. You do not have the insight that I have. I have seen, Solomon says, so many people who have destroyed their lives through the sexual sin. And therefore, I want you to stay away from it. And therefore, these instructions. And in fact, Solomon speaks about this multiple times. In chapter 2, verse 18 and 19, he says, death is the end result of this sin. Look at what he says. He says, surely her house leads down to death, and her paths to the spirits of the dead. None who go to her return or attain the paths of life. So he speaks about one of the consequences, which is death. In other words, separation. Adultery, sexual immorality could cause the death of many kinds of relationships. One's relationship with one's spouse could be separated. One's relationship with one's children could be lost. One's relationship with one's community could be lost. And therefore, Solomon is speaking about the kind of death that this kind of adultery brings about. When we come to chapter 5, and this is also a chapter that speaks about the same thing, we will read from verses 3 to 6, where he is talking about the consequence of adultery. He says, "For the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword." In other words, in the beginning, the promise of temptation is very brilliant, but ultimately it does not provide what it promises. The end result is bitterness, bitter like gall, and it's like a double-edged sword piercing through you. And verses 5 and 6, he says, "Her feet go down to death, her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her path wander aimlessly, but she does not know it." So the paths towards sexual immorality are paths towards death and destruction. The evil woman does not pay attention to any of these, but the father is instructing the son, "I want you to pay attention to the consequences that could befall you, and therefore stay away from all of these." And so verse 8 is exactly that. Solomon is telling his son, he says, "Keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house." And so he is saying that the best way to stay away from temptation is to stay away from that wrong place and that wrong time. We talked about that in our previous video. In fact, Paul instructs Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, he says, "Flee from all youthful desires." In other words, run away when such kinds of temptations come. The best defense is to run away. In fact, the longer one lingers in the presence of temptation, the greater is the danger. In other words, don't linger around where temptations are possible. If you linger around there, greater is the possibility that you fall into the sin. Now let me come to chapter 7 and provide us with several consequences. I have a list of 10 consequences that would come upon this young gullible person. Consequence number 1 that Solomon is talking about is the consequence of shame. Look at what he says, "Lest you lose your honor to others." This is chapter 5, verse 9. You would lose your honor and respect. In other words, shame would come upon you. Adultery, sexual immorality, is attached to shame. That's one of the consequences. Loss of respect for you. That's consequence number 1. Consequence number 2 could be sickness. Look at what he says in 9b. "And your dignity to one who is cruel." In the footnote and in other translations, we read, "Your ears to one who is cruel." It could be talking about a sickness that could befall a person who is involved in sexual immorality and the loss of one's ears to this cruel sickness. So consequence number 1, shame. Consequence number 2 is sickness. Consequence number 3 in verse 10 is speaking about loss of wealth. Look at what he says, "Lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich the house of another." Sexual immorality or adulterous relationship could result in your losing your wealth. Strangers would feast on your wealth, and your hard work would enrich the house of another. In Solomon's day, we do not know exactly how that would work out. Probably there would be blackmail involved. "I would let your family members know if you do not pay me such amount of money." And that kind of constant blackmail is probably what Solomon had in mind. But even in today's world, These kinds of sins often result in different kinds of loss of wealth. I don't think I need to stop there and explain that. There is loss of wealth involved, according to Solomon, because of sexual immorality, and he's advising his son to stay away from that. Consequence number 4 is regrets. And regrets even at the end of one's life. In other words, Solomon is trying to tell the young man that you stay away from sexual immorality because it would have consequences that would last forever. Verses 11 to 13. At the end of your life, you will groan. At the end, in other words, the consequences of sexual immorality could last long into one's life. At the end of your life, you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. He's talking about the regrets that one could have. Verse 12, what would you say at the end of your life, at the end of your journey on earth? You would say, how I hated discipline and how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or turn my ear to my instructors. In other words, when I was young, I thought I knew better. I did not want to listen to my father's instructions or to my mother's commands. I did not want to listen to my teachers or anyone who advised me wisdom. I thought I knew what was best for myself, but at the end of one's life, he is regretting over the decisions that he has made in his life. And therefore, Solomon is trying to tell his son, if you do not want to be in a situation like that, when at the age of 60 or 70 or 80, you're regretting the decisions that you made at 20 or 21 or 22, he is saying, don't make those decisions at 21 and 22 so that you will not have to face these regrets towards the end of your life. Verse 14 speaks about the 5th consequence, which is public exposure and shame. Verse 14, it reads, and I was soon in serious trouble in the assembly of God's people. Now, this is the person who has fallen into sexual sin, speaking about the consequences of it at the end of one's life. He says, I was soon in serious trouble in the assembly of God's people. In other words, I was publicly exposed, I was put to shame, and there was nothing that I could do with which I could get out of it, and something that could not be wiped off. Towards the end of one's life, one is remembering the public exposure and the shame that has befallen that person because of the sexual sin. In other words, the consequences are great. Do not fall into it. Consequence number 6 is self-destruction, and that is talked about in chapter 6, verse 32. This is also a chapter in which Solomon has much to say, and in verse 32 he says, but a man who commits adultery has no sense. Whoever does so destroys himself. So a person who commits sexual sin is destroying himself. Self-destruction, that's a consequence of sexual sin. In number 7, disgrace and everlasting shame. This is talked to us in chapter 6, verse 33. Blows and disgrace are his lot, and his shame will never be wiped away. Blows and disgrace. In other words, you will have people coming up against you, probably the husband of the adulterous woman. You would receive blows, you would receive disgrace, and your shame will never be wiped away. It will last for a lifetime. Consequence number 8 is revenge of people that are affected by it. Verse 34 of chapter 6. For jealousy arouses a husband's fury, and he will show no mercy when he takes revenge. In fact, you may know of murders that happen, or huge consequences of that kind. Revenge being taken because somebody is very, very hurt, because somebody else has entered into their family and has committed sexual adultery, immorality, and so on. So jealousy arouses a husband's fury, and he will show no mercy when he takes revenge, is what he is saying. Chapter 7, verse 26. He says that one is introduced into the hall of shame when one falls into this. Look at what he says in verse 26. Many are the victims she has brought down, her slain are a mighty throng. That means you enter into a special category of people. You enter into the hall of shame where many people are there. It's not a few people that have been brought down by sexual immorality. Many people. And another translation says that even the mighty have been brought down by her. In other words, it's not just the weak and the gullible and the simple that have fallen prey to the temptations of sexual immorality. Even many mighty men and women have fallen down to this. And verse 27, the 10th consequence that Solomon is talking about, he says, her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. It's not a narrow way, it's not a narrow gate, it's a broad gate and a broad road. Her house is a highway to the grave, leading down to the chambers of death. So let me bring this to a conclusion. Here is the older person advising a younger person. Here is the father advising the son about the consequences of adultery. And he says that there are 10 consequences to this. Number 1 is shame. Number 2 is sickness. Number 3 is loss of wealth. Number 4 is regrets even at the end of one's life. Number 5 is public exposure and shame. Number 6 is self-destruction. Number 7 is disgrace. Number 8 is revenge. Number 9 is being introduced into that hall of shame. And number 10 is death. And so Solomon is telling the young person, you don't have to commit the sin and then experience all these consequences. Wisdom is found in realizing these consequences and thus staying away from the adulterous woman or the adulterous man and staying away from any kind of sexual sin. And with that, we stop with section 2 of our 3-part series where we are talking about the warnings against adultery. In part 1, we talked about the temptations of adultery, and in this video, we talked about the consequences of adultery. And in part 3, we're going to talk about advice given by Solomon against adultery or regarding adultery. And I believe that this would be a blessing to all of us.